Hi, Psych 105 students. We're going to go ahead and get started on discussing chapters 7 and 9 today. We're going to go through and discuss depression, and we're also going to be talking about bipolar disorder, and then we'll also be talking about suicide, the causes and triggers for suicide. So let's go ahead and get started with that. First, we're going to begin, like I said, with talking about depressive and bipolar disorders. So let's go ahead and get started on that. So our top topics today, let's see if I can get there, are, like I mentioned, we'll talk about major depressive disorder and other depressive disorders, depression in general. We're going to talk about bipolar disorder, and then we'll talk about suicide. So let's start with depressive disorders and bipolar disorders. And in order to do that, we really need to come up with some definitions, working definitions of what we're talking about when we're talking about depression and when we're talking about mania that is included in bipolar disorders. So let's go ahead and take a look at those. So the first definition that I want you to be aware of as we're talking about these disorders. These are psychological disorders that we're going to talk about today. The first definition I want you to understand is, what is depression? I think most people can relate to depression and understand it because it's depression is aligned with normal feelings like sadness. And so if you're aware of what sadness is, you're likely aware of what depression is in terms of how it feels. But depression is really more than just a feeling of sadness. It includes feeling lack of self-worth, feeling guilty about things, having other symptoms, interruptions in sleep and all of those things. So we're going to go in the details of it, but just know that when we're talking about depression, we're talking about a very low state, a very sad state. The next definition I want you to understand is mania. So when we're talking about mania, that's basically the opposite of depression. Mania is this state of energy. You have a high level of energy. You have feelings of euphoria. There's often really high risk behaviors, very animated. People have a very as it describes here, an exaggerated belief that the world is theirs for the taking. There is just this feeling of it's all going great, or I can do everything, I'm invincible, those kinds of feelings, and can be high energy, very high energy. So when people are experiencing mania, that's what it looks like. I want to right now differentiate and mention that when we're talking about depression and we're talking about mania, these you don't qualify for depression or mania if either of these are drug induced. So if you are experiencing mania because you've just taken a stimulant drug like a methamphetamine, that's not mania. That's a drug induced state of euphoria or high. So the difference is that people who experience depression or mania or are diagnosed with major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder, they're experiencing that without it being onset by any kind of substance. So now that you kind of have an understanding of what depression is generally and mania is generally, I want to help you understand the categories of disorders. So we have depressive disorders. We'll find those in the DSM. Our trusty DSM-5. Depressive disorders are disorders that include unipolar depression, and the text refers to it as unipolar depression. Really, what that's saying is it's one-sided depression. In other words, it's depression only. And when we're talking about bipolar disorder, we're talking about two extreme ends of mood. So we're talking about the two poles on a globe. You've got the North Pole and the South Pole. Think of that when we talk about bipolar. We're talking about two poles. So we've got the North Pole and the South Pole. They're the opposites. So when we're talking about depressive disorders, and then we're talking about unipolar depression, we're talking about it's just the North Pole. In other words, it's just depression, and it doesn't include the mania. When we're talking about bipolar disorders, however, we're talking about depression. Sorry, I clicked the wrong button here. We're talking about bipolar disorders. We're talking about moods that shift between depression and mania, and so they go to the opposite sides. So when we're talking about depressive disorders, these are disorders. There are several disorders. It's not just major depressive disorder. There's a bunch of other depression, forms of depression, how it shows up. And then when we're talking about bipolar disorder, we're going to talk about where those disorders of mood, where it's not just depression, it's also depression and mania that characterize it. Now, I want to mention, as we're talking about depression, for some people, anyone who's experienced depression, or if you know someone with depression, these can be triggering topics for people. And so I just want to give you that warning and an awareness that whenever we talk about something that might be triggering, I always try to warn people. I have a few videos today sharing with people about people's lives who are experiencing depression as well as bipolar disorder. And, at any time, make sure that you're being self-aware of your own experience and how you're feeling, so that if some of these videos or topics that we talk about, if you find that it's triggering in you or bringing up in you feelings of sadness or just real discomfort, please take a break and please pause the lecture. That's the beauty of taking an online class, is you can pause the lecture, you can take a moment to give yourself some self-care, do some breathing, watch something else, talk with a friend, take a nice, warm, comforting shower, go for a swim if you have that available to you. Just, go for a walk, get outside, or get some exercise, or read a book. Just do anything that you can think of to help you, anything that works for you to help you feel better. And then come back to it later. And just be aware that that's okay, and that can happen sometimes. I just want to make sure you are taking good care of yourself, because the topics that we're talking about today are particularly heavy topics. When we're talking about depression, we're talking about bipolar disorder, and especially as we talk about suicide and suicidal ideation and what triggers that, and what we can do to intervene. All of those things can be triggering topics, and I just want to make sure that you're taking good care of yourselves. And if you need any support, please reach out for that. You can always contact Pirate Care here at MJC. That's an on-the-phone counseling service that's available. You can also email me so I can get you connected. We have online counselors at MJC who are able you can connect with online, you can meet face-to-face when that's available. So there are a lot of options, and I just want to make sure you have that support. Okay. So now we know what to do and how to take care of yourselves. So let's look a little bit about depression and how the prevalence of depression in the United States. So let's just talk specifically about the United States. About 8% of U.S. adults suffer from depression, and they say severe unipolar depression in any given year. So when we're talking about depression, it's not uncommon. It's one of the more commonly diagnosed and commonly treated disorders in the U.S. When you look at the impact that depression has on national disability rates as well as mortality rates, India and China, number 1 and number 2, large population countries, and then the United States is number 3. There's a prevalence of that. You can see it also in many other countries as well. And depression is a universal psychological disorder that we see universally. And about 20% of us will experience a period of depression at some point in our lives. So it's something that it's important to recognize. It's important to, in recognizing it, then connect with treatment. So it's an important thing for you to know about, whether it will happen to you or you're one of the 20% that's going to experience it, or the 80% that are going to be aware of what it is and help other people become aware of it, it's important to get them treatment and care so that it doesn't persist. But there is a high rate of depression among people who are chronically ill, elderly. And so depression is actually somewhat prevalent in the elderly population. So we want to look at today, what are the symptoms of depression? And then we'll look at what are some of the possible treatments. We'll go into specific treatments later on in the semester, but I do want to touch on kind of what are the causes of depression and how we can recognize it. So some of the symptoms of depression have there's emotional, there's motivational, behavioral, cognitive, and physical symptoms. Depression is something that is very all-consuming. It affects all of these areas. So let's go ahead and look at some of the diagnoses for depression that we can find in the DSM-5. So if you look in the DSM-5, one of the categories we talked about, how the DSM-5 has different categories. One of the categories for depression, for depressive disorder, and a few of the depressive disorders that fit under that category are major depressive disorder, persistent depressive disorder, which used to be called dysthymia. We talked about how different disorders have changed names in the newest version. It used to be called dysthymia, now it's called persistent depressive disorder. There's a premenstrual dysphoric disorder as well. So let's look at a few of these and on how one would be diagnosed with this. So just like actually in all these disorders, it's important to kind of have an understanding of what is a depressive episode actually look like. You know, you and I get sad. Everybody gets sad sometimes. When do we know that it's actually a depressive episode, right? Well, the first major criteria for any disorder is that it's causing you some sort of impairment, right? So we know that. We know that just off the bat, that there's the behaviors or the things that we're feeling or whatever we're experiencing has to cause some impairment in our lives. And when we say impairment, we're talking about, does it interfere with our relationships? Is it interfering with our job? Are we unable to go to school? Are we unable to do our daily functioning in life? Are we unable to do the dishes and get out of bed and take care of the things that we need to take care of because of the depression? Well, that would be impairment. So is there an impairment there, right? And then in order for you to have a depressive episode, so beyond just feeling sad, this is the qualification for what is a depressive episode. So it has to last for 2 weeks, at least 2 weeks, and you've got to see either of these two things, either an increase in the depressed mood, so in other words, more for the majority of the day, more days than not over that 2-week period, you've got to feel that sadness, and or one or the other or both, there's got to be a decrease in enjoyment or interest, just a loss of pleasure in doing anything. Not interested in hanging out with friends anymore, not interested in watching their kids' soccer game, not interested in even watching a movie. Nothing takes interest or has enjoyment anymore. So in order to qualify for a major depressive episode, it's got to last at least 2 weeks, and one of those two symptoms has to be there, either really like the increase in that sadness or a decrease in enjoyment in things. So usually you'll see both, honestly, but to qualify for depression, for a depressive episode, that's what you're going to see. And then for the same 2 weeks, that person is also going to have at least 3 of these 4 symptoms. So they're going to have a change in their eating. So either they're going to be having like an increase in appetite where they just eat all the time. We'll see that with people, they'll gain weight in depression, or they will lose their appetite and not want to eat anymore, and they'll lose a bunch of weight. So we'll see their appetites change, and therefore usually their weight will also change. We see a change in their sleeping. So sleep can be affected. I've had a client in the past who I worked with who she would go to high school, then she would come home and she would take a nap from about 3 to about 5. she'd get up at 5, eat dinner, and then go to bed about, 7, and then wake up in the morning and go to school, and same thing. So she was awake for school, and then she was awake for probably an hour after that, after that school period. She was sleeping too much. She was sleeping a lot. And for some people with depression, sleep is kind of an escape, and so they'll use that, or they'll just we're going to talk about energy levels in a minute, but there's a feeling of fatigue that goes along with it, that can go along with it, and so it can make them want to sleep more. But depression can also interrupt sleep in that it can cause insomnia, where you don't sleep enough, or your sleep is interrupted, where you can't get to sleep, or you go to sleep, but then you wake up in the middle of the night and you can't get back to sleep. So we'll see sleep interruption with depression. We'll see changes in motor activity. So and when we're talking about motor, we're talking about movement, right? So either the person will become extremely restless and agitated and just not easily soothed, or you're going to see a decrease in their motor activity, where they're just moving really slowly. I see that more commonly. I've seen that more commonly, where there's just a slowness to them, a very calm, kind of weighed down presence in their movement, and that you'll see with depression. Either that, or there's just that, like I said, that agitation, wringing of hands, just can't settle down. So either one of those, but we'll see that their motor activity is affected. Energy levels can also be affected. So like I mentioned, they'll have that daily fatigue or lethargy, where they just feel tired. They don't feel like they have a lot of energy. Also, feelings of worthlessness. Sometimes they can have excessive feelings of guilt, even guilt that's not even appropriate to them. Like they carry around the responsibility of things that are not related to them, or are not as, they couldn't possibly be as responsible for them as they claim to be, or are accepting responsibility for. And so we'll see that guilt, or the feelings of worthlessness, where they'll say things like, people would be better off without me, I'm a burden, those kinds of feelings. The next one is the reduction in concentration, so inability to concentrate or make decisions. So, they'll be at work and they're trying to focus on their work, but they just can't concentrate. They're thinking of other things. They can't motivate themselves to get that energy to focus and really finish their task that they need to, or make any kinds of big decisions. It's just too difficult. I think I said 3 out of the 4, but it's at least 3 of these symptoms. You can have 3 or more. Another symptom of depression can be thoughts of death and or suicide. It doesn't necessarily have to be suicide. Sometimes people can just have a preoccupation with death, thinking about death. And then, of course, suicide, thoughts of suicide, suicidal ideation, we call it, and that means having ideas about suicide, making plans for suicide, or even attempts at suicide. Any thoughts, recurring thoughts of death can be a symptom of depression. And of course, with all of this, you're going to see some sort of distress or impairment. It's hard to imagine someone having all these symptoms and not having some sort of distress or impairment, but it just goes, and so it kind of goes without saying. But really, in order to qualify as a major depressive episode, like I said, these symptoms need to be present, and there has to be some kind of impairment in the person's life, some kind of something that's getting in the way of them doing what they need to be doing. So now let's look at the diagnosis of depression. So now we know what a depressive episode is. We have all of this as the category for a depressive episode. We know what a depressive episode is. So what is the qualification for now a major depression? So let's look at that. We've talked about what are some of the disorders, the depressive disorders. So one of the depressive disorders that we'll find in the DSM is the major depressive disorder. And in order to be qualified to have major depressive disorder, you have to have had one presence of a major depressive episode, and you cannot have any mania or hypomania along with that. So that wouldn't qualify. So when we talked about mania, we talked about the really up mood. If you have an occurrence of a major depressive episode and any type of mania, we'll talk about hypomania in a minute, but if you have any of that upper feeling too, on in contrast, it wouldn't be qualified as major depressive disorder. It would qualify as a bipolar disorder instead. So a major depressive episode. There's also persistent depressive disorder, which, like I said, used to be called dysthymia. That is where someone is experiencing major depression for at least 2 years. And that depression, when someone is experiencing persistent depressive disorder, usually the depression just becomes almost kind of like who they are. It's all of those kinds of depressive symptoms, but it's hard to distinguish their depression from their normal functioning. So for someone who's experiencing major depressive disorder, you can see when they have gotten out of that episode of depression. You can see a difference. They can see a difference. However, for someone with persistent depressive disorder, it has to last at least 2 years. For children, it only has to be for a year. And I will mention too, for children, another difference. When you see major depressive disorder for children, a lot of times for kids, you don't necessarily see the sadness. You see irritability. So they're easily irritated, kind of argumentative. You'll see that more likely just, angry and bitter and irritable rather than an overwhelming sadness. You may see the sadness as well, but more often you're going to see, for children with major depressive disorder, you're going to see that irritability show up. And so for persistent depressive disorder, that's really the only difference, is the length of time. It can be only a year that they start to feel this way, or you've seen the change that they feel this way over time. It's kind of part of their functioning. But for adults, it is the symptoms of depression for at least 2 years. And again, no mania or hypomania. And of course, that's causing them distress or impairment. So those are two very common or well-known depressive disorders. Another depressive disorder that you've probably heard of is major depressive disorder with a postpartum onset. And so when we're talking about postpartum or peripartum, because sometimes for people who are experiencing postpartum depression, the depression can start before they have the baby. So when we say peripartum, it means kind of like postpartum means after you've had the baby, but peripartum depression is talking about when you're pregnant and about to have a baby and afterward. So for postpartum depression, basically it's major depressive disorder, but it has a postpartum onset, and there are very unique parts to that. Sometimes that can lead to, of course, the same kind of symptoms as depression, where you've got the sadness and the despair, even tearfulness, sleep disturbance, all of that. But it can also lead to very much more extreme or detrimental parent-child relationship issues. We can see moms who can have psychotic episodes related to their postpartum depression. And there are a lot of research. There's a lot of research about why that happens, and it can be because of hormonal changes. It can be, you could have a genetic predisposition. There might be just huge lifestyle changes that we're, are having a hard time adjusting to. So there are a lot of causes to that. I want to show you a short video about postpartum onset depression to kind of illustrate what that's like and what that experience is like. So pay attention to the experience that these people have had with peripartum or postpartum depression.
Allison Herman couldn't be more thrilled about her baby boy. But just a few months ago, she was overwhelmed, almost terrified.
You really start to think, oh my God, how can I get through this?
Even basic duties like feeding seemed pressure-packed.
I was frustrating because there was nothing I could do to try and make her feel better.
I was practically huddled in a ball in my own house.
As many as 80% of new mothers experience a brief period of moodiness, many call the baby blues. But 1 in 5 fall into postpartum depression, a more serious condition that can stretch on for months.
They start to feel like nothing brings them pleasure. Everything is effortful.
What causes postpartum depression is still a mystery. Hormonal changes appear to play a role, but cultural expectations also push mothers to the edge.
A lot of attention gets put towards the baby. The mother kind of gets pushed aside sometimes.
Adding to the stress is the need in many families for women to be both mother and breadwinner.
I didn't know how to split myself into two people to take care of my daughter, who was almost 4, and my newborn son.
There was some tough times at that point.
At her worst, Guzmano began to fantasize about driving her car into a highway divider.
I just wanted to hit that, be injured, and then be hospitalized just so somebody could take care of me. I felt like I had lost myself.
We are educated to this. We do know about it. Why is it still happening?
Many, like postpartum specialist Joyce Venice, blame the embarrassment of seeking help. Experts say almost all women with postpartum depression can be successfully treated. Talking openly to others about their fears and stress is often the best medicine.
It's a very common problem.
Candy Guzmano and Allison Herman now understand their depression is hardly unique. That's been a key to lifting themselves out of despair to focus on what's really important.
This is my life, my child. I'm going to do things the way it works for me and him, because I've realized that that's all that's important, is taking care of us.
On May 17, 2004, Carolyn Brink gave birth to her first child, Zachary. What do you remember from that time?
Nothing.
You don't remember going into labor?
No.
Giving birth?
No.
Holding your son for the first time?
It kills me, but no, I don't.
Carolyn's upbeat personality completely changed.
It really was like a different person. It was like the person who, I had met and fallen in love with and married was just not there anymore. And she was replaced by this sort of, a shell or a husk of a person that just wasn't the person that I knew.
As Carolyn became more and more detached, her mother, Mary Jane, had to step in to take care of the baby.
It was so foreign to me, I couldn't understand what was even going on. And then I realized somewhere, I'm thinking, does she have postpartum depression?
When Demian and Mary Jane saw a list of symptoms for postpartum depression, it described Carolyn's condition perfectly.
What did she say? What were these things that she was telling you?
We've made a terrible mistake. I don't know why we thought we could have a child. I don't want to do this. This is way too hard.
She actually came down one day and she had a plan for how to give Zachary away to somebody.
To hear that you were talking that way? What do you think?
It's crazy, because that's just not me. That's just not me. I love life.
For the next few months, Carolyn saw a psychiatrist and went on antidepressants.
By this time, that's 2-3 months that we've gone through 3 different medications, and none of them worked. She didn't have any relief from the depression at any time.
She was even threatening to take her own life.
Do you think that those threats were serious?
Yeah, I do.
My son needed a mother. And if I didn't help us all get through this and help her get through it, he maybe wouldn't have one day.
Desperate to find Carolyn help, her family sent her halfway across the country to Dr. David Mrazek at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota.
The family and friends that a woman have are the first line of defense against this depression. So if they see that something isn't right, then they need to pull together and to find a way to get some help.
The Mayo Clinic was the only facility in the world using a breakthrough genetic test called the P450. By analyzing DNA, it measures how well a person metabolizes specific drugs, including antidepressants. It may have saved Carolyn's life.
It's still amazing to me how many psychiatrists haven't really learned about this test.
The very drugs that were supposed to help Carolyn actually were hindering her recovery. But thanks to the new test, doctors at the Mayo Clinic were able to get her on the right medications and into therapy. And after just a few weeks, Carolyn was on the right track.
She called us from the hospital, And she said, I figured out something. And she said, I'm not a bad mother. I knew she was going to be okay from that moment on.
Gosh! Zachary's almost 3 years old now, and though the time after his birth is still a blank to Carolyn, she's busy making new memories as a full-time mom.
When you look at Zachary today, that same little guy that you told your mom you wanted to give up for adoption, what do you think?
I think he's just the most wonderful thing that has ever happened to me. I'm so grateful to my family that they didn't give up on me. I just think I'm so lucky.
I love you.
I love you, dear.
So I like that video because, and hopefully it'll show up again, but I like that video because it shows how depression can affect people and change totally their lives. I think postpartum onset depression is particularly interesting because of the major changes that are happening in a woman's life and in her body hormonally after giving birth, and just how impactful that can be. So it's really something to be aware of. I think there is a lot of expectation in society that, even this slide is talking about how, this should be such a happy time in someone's life. I worked in adoption for 10 years. I worked as a social worker in an adoption agency, working with women who are making adoption plans for their children, as well as for women who were adopting. And interestingly, there is such a thing, although it's not something that is diagnosed in the DSM, but there is post-adoption depression as well, where we don't see the changes that are happening hormonally from pregnancy, from going from pregnancy to parenting. We don't have the same changes, but we still have a very similar occurrence of post-adoption depression, where parenting, just they've taken a child, they're parenting, and just the huge change in the lifestyle is really a difficult adjustment. And so that would probably qualify as an adjustment disorder, which is another psychological disorder. But interesting that we see something similar occasionally happen in adoption as well as in childbirth. I think there are a lot of factors that contribute to it. Some of it is just that change, like we said, in lifestyle as well as hormones. So good video. I think that there is a lot of stigma that gets in the way of women seeking help for postpartum depression. But if you understand about it and you know someone who you see changes in them postpartum, or even right before having a baby, you see changes in mood and just, changes overall, you can see how what you can do to intervene. As we saw in the video, how important it is to be aware and to be connected to people. And that is the first line of defense, as he mentioned, in getting treatment and help. So there are, of course, like we've already talked about, some of the causes. I'm going to leave this slide on here, but I'll let you refer to it as we talk about comparing the disorders, bipolar as well as depression. So of course there, like we said, chemical issues. For some people, depression is caused by chemical changes in the brain, depending on levels of serotonin and norepinephrine. Norepinephrine. So I think I said that right. Hormonal changes and so on. There's circuitry in the brain. You can take a look at that more. Of course, all of that is a biological perspective. So if you have the theoretical orientation that depression is caused by these biological causes, chemical and hormonal and circuitry-wise in the brain, then of course you're going to look at treatment for that. And I think there's a lot of evidence for that in the medical world. If you have a psychodynamic view, if you're of the Freudian type, you're going to see that people are regressing potentially to an earlier stage of development. That might be how you describe depression. If you have a cognitive behavioral view, you're going to see that depression is caused by problems in thinking dysfunctional thinking, or it's caused in part by problematic behaviors that are related to being rewarded for having depression. So they could describe it that maybe there's some reason why it's rewarding you to in some ways be depressed. So that would be that behavioral view. Of course, in cognitive therapists believe that there is a negative type of thinking pattern that contributes to depression as well. So there are a lot of different causes for depression, and I'm sure you read about those in the book. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into detail about each of those, but I just want you to understand what depression looks like, what are the symptoms, and how does it impact people. When we see depressed parents and their children interact, you see when you look at a depressed parent interacting with a child versus a non-depressed parent, non-depressed parents are in purple here. Let's see if I can make myself disappear for a minute. We see non-depressed parents are going to be more likely to play with their children, hug and cuddle their children, all very developmentally appropriate and necessary things for a parent to do. Sing, play music, read to them, do some sort of bedtime routine that allows that predictability. And then we're going to see also a lower level of non-depressed parents they get less frustrated, yell at a child sometimes or often. We're going to see that more with depressed parents. So we'll see that irritability happening in depressed parents more often than with non-depressed parents. So the impact can be had on parenting, and that can also be just one of those impairments that we're talking about. So now let's go ahead and move forward talking about bipolar disorders. So again, we've talked about unipolar depression, in other words, major depressive disorders, and now we're going to talk about bipolar disorders, which are the type of disorders, again, that have both a high and a low point to them. So bipolar, the two poles, high and low. So there are actually two kinds of bipolar disorder. There is bipolar 1, and then there is bipolar 2, according to the DSM-5. And the bipolar 1 disorder is a type of bipolar where you experience a longer state of mania. So you're going to have a manic episode that lasts at least 7 days. And when we talk about a manic episode, we talked briefly about what is mania, but let's go ahead and define what a manic episode is. So we've got, for bipolar 1, we have a manic episode that's going to last 7 days or more. For bipolar 2, usually it is a hypomanic, so it's a little bit less than the manic, so it's only 4 days or more. When it gets 7 days or more, it goes into bipolar 1 territory. And so if you've had a manic episode, what's happened is, for the full-blown mania, is you've got a week or more, so 7 days or more, a person is going to be abnormally inflated, unrestrained, irritable, just heightened energy. I mentioned how there's a difference between someone who's on meth and who is on, experiencing mania, but you may not be able to see the difference. If you encounter someone who appears to be, strung out on meth, that heightened energy, that feelings of like I can't lose, or meth or any other stimulant really. But if you come up across someone like that, the only way to tell the difference sometimes is to see if they, do a blood test and see if they have drugs in their system, and that's how you can tell the difference between mania and meth. So if that gives you an idea, of what it looks like. I mean, there's other things that differentiate between the two, but there's still similarities in that heightened level of arousal, right? If they are experiencing that mania, they've got that inflated and high mood, they're also going to have at least 3 of these symptoms. So we talked about the depressive episode. Now we're talking about a manic episode, what that looks like. They're going to have feelings of grandiosity, overblown self-esteem. They are going to have a significantly reduced need for sleep. For some people, they feel rested after less than 3 hours of sleep. And now I know some of you are like, I don't need that much sleep either. Well, if it lasts and occurs with all of these other symptoms, it might be manic episode, or it might be a manic episode, but more than likely it might be just, well, then I make up for sleep later or whatever. But for people experiencing mania for a week or more, they won't need more than 3 hours of sleep at a time. Sometimes they don't sleep at all during that period. They have rapidly shifting ideas. They have this, sense that they're coming up with they're coming up with creative ideas. They're experiencing just everything's coming at them really fast. They describe it sometimes as feeling like overly sensitive to their senses. Like everything is just, coming at them in full color and full volume, and they're easily distracted and in other can be pulled in a lot of different directions. They have a lot of movement and agitation, and this is one of the most common things I see with mania, is that they will pursue high-risk activities, potential problematic activities that have severe consequences. We'll see people who are experiencing manic episode engaging in extramarital affairs, which obviously have potential to ruin their relationship, their marital relationship. They will have unprotected sex. They will engage, and it's not all about sex, but they will also engage in drug use and gambling. Some people will go on shopping sprees. Other people will invest a ton of money in a very risky stock market or, investment. Just doing kinds of behaviors that they feel like they can't lose. So it's a very dangerous and detrimental kind of period for them. And it causes a significant, of course, amount of stress or distress, and of course that impairment in their life. So many people have been diagnosed, many famous people have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And some of them say, when I have my mania, I am super creative and I am able to do just incredible works of art or film or dance or what have you. You can look up people with bipolar disorder online. I don't know if it's accurate, some of those, but some people have been very forthright with their diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Very famous and creative people. I know, I think like Ernest Hemingway was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Another director, I think it was Francis Ford Coppola, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And a lot of these people really value that mania that they kind of receive. It's just this burst of creativity. The unfortunate side is, for many of them, is all of the distress and impairment that it causes to their relationships, to their lives, when they have this manic episode, how it ends up hurting them later on. And so anyway, so that kind of defines what is a manic episode. So let's look really quickly at what makes a bipolar disorder and what it looks like. So for a bipolar 1 disorder diagnosis, you're going to have someone who experiences a manic episode. That is that 7 days or more of that heightened activity. They can have, but it's not necessary, they can have in addition to the manic episode, they can also have major depressive episodes, either before or after the manic episode, or a hypomanic episode. But really, they've got just that extreme manic episode is what qualifies for that bipolar 1 disorder. For bipolar 2 disorder, you're going to see maybe a little bit less mania, 4 days or more instead of 7. So not really like a lot less, but still not sleeping, having these risky behaviors. And then it's going to be accompanied by the major depression or other hypomanic episodes. So if you're diagnosed with a bipolar 2 disorder, you can't have had an actual manic episode. It can only be the hypomanic, which is the lesser manic episode. So you're going to have presence of depression and mania for the bipolar 2 disorder. Anytime you have the extreme mania, so the 7 days or more, you're going to have the diagnosis of bipolar 1. Another type of bipolar disorder, but it's not called bipolar, it's kind of a milder version of bipolar disorder, and that's called cyclothymic disorder, and that is where you have these hypomania episodes and depression symptoms, but you can have kind of normal moods in between there. And it can evolve into bipolar 1 or bipolar 2, but it's just basically a milder symptomology than the bipolar disorders. So these mood episodes can be really damaging, like we're talking about with impairment, with what can happen. And to diagnose a bipolar disorder, when someone is having a bipolar disorder, usually when they're experiencing, for a bipolar 2, when they're experiencing the mania as well as the severe depression, the riskiest time for people is not actually during the depressive stage, it's during the manic stage, because that's where they're going to be acting more impulsively. And so in a moment when we're talking about suicide and the risk of suicide, be aware of that people who are experiencing bipolar disorder, especially bipolar 2 with the really high, or the highs and the lows, the long lows, they have a tendency, if they are at risk of suicide, they're going to be more likely to act on the suicide attempt during that mania stage when they're feeling really good and impulsive, and because there is this feeling like, I don't want to go back to that depressive, sad state where I can't act. So they're at most risk for suicide during that mania. Now, we're talking about the causes of bipolar disorders. They've done a lot of research and they've had, a hard time finding causes of it. But as with depression, there is neurotransmitter activity that can be to blame for that, brain structure, and of course genetic influences. I want to show you a video now of a family who has experienced bipolar disorder generationally, and just to have an idea of what it's like, what to experience bipolar disorder, and also within the family system, how it has impacted their family. It's a really fascinating kind of case study of genetics and bipolar disorder and what it's like.
You can't tell by looking at this photograph that this is the face of mental illness, because we all look so Catholic. This is me when I was 17. These are my parents in their engagement party. Our family was called the Crazies because my mom had bipolar, my dad had bipolar, and my sister. My dad was a very hard-working pathologist. He got laid off when he was 40 from a Catholic hospital in Savannah. An outside source went and talked to the nuns, and they decided to let him go. It was because he had bipolar or manic depression then. If he couldn't be a doctor, then he didn't want to be anything. He died when I was 29.
The word is a very powerful thing. You can wreck people's lives by talking about them.
It was just devastating as a kid to feel like the neighbors were all watching, and I still feel like today, if I lived there, I'd be judged because of my parents' mental health and probably now my own. I think the hardest time that I had was my initial knowledge that I had the disease, because I had seen it my whole life and I had been scared of it my whole life. And then here it comes. And it got me. These are art pieces called Indian mandalas. A mandala is like a positive affirmation or a prayer that if you send out to a particular person, then good will come to you. I learned about art therapy when I was a psych major in college. It's very calming and soothing, and it just helps you feel better. These are my medications that I take for my bipolar disorder. It really helps reduce the cycles of my illness and helps keep me stable. I would be so dysfunctional without my medication. I can't even imagine what my life would be like.
There are certain people who have an extra rhythm to their life. One that's not just getting up and going to bed, but it's a longer rhythm of, for weeks at a time, feeling very good or very bad and cycling through that. And it seems to be more pronounced in everybody in our family.
The depression comes on rather suddenly each time. It's like a leaden paralysis. My limbs feel heavy and I feel like I'm paralyzed. I'll sleep for 20 hours a day for days on end. When I'm feeling manic, all my senses go full throttle. I do things like sit in the car and listen to the radio. I hear the words so much better, and everything is profound and has more meaning. I stop thinking rationally. I spend a lot of money, like $300 or $400 a pop, and it's just devastating. My disorder is bipolar 1, which means that I have had a psychotic break.
The main thing that you notice when someone's in a psychotic episode is their memory starts to not work right. And then you start to realize that they're having trouble just remembering minute to minute what's going on.
I was seeing things that weren't there, and was creating things that weren't there. And it was just all an illusion.
It was horrible, heartbreaking. I didn't know what to do. At one point, she didn't recognize me. She just was not May.
We're going to see my sister Anna. Anna also has bipolar. I think that I've always understood her and tried to oversee her care. But I think now that we have to struggle with the same disease, I think it does bring a stronger bond.
May!
Hi, sweetie.
So good to see you.
These are for you.
I just love her. The lady you may have heard a little bit about is my best friend. She's been so encouraging and so loving and so giving. Being with me is a good haven for my soul.
I love you, Anna.
You had faith in me. You saw what I couldn't see. You looked beyond what others had branded me to be. You looked beyond the stigma into the pain I bore. You touched my heart in such a way that I'd feel loved once more.
I've always been a loving person and try and be genuine and caring. You know, the more I give out, the more I feel like I get that back.
These kinds of problems do not mean you can't have a life that's happy. It's part of the price we pay for having these wonderful advanced brains that allow us to live and enjoy life as we do. Just doesn't always work as we would like all the time.
It's amazing to me that she can stay so positive with all that she's had to deal with.
I know the people that stand behind me, and my family has been incredibly supportive. It's been a long struggle, and I think I'm on the better end of it. You know, have people that care about me and food to eat and a place to live and lots of support. You know, that says a lot.
What I like about that video is really looking at how people can live functionally with bipolar disorder, but how it is so impactful on individuals and families. We can see the genetic component then in that family that we were able to see, but also how she describes her experience of being just hit by the depression with her bipolar disorder, and just how it really overwhelms her, and just she's sleeping so much, and anyway, it's really very can be debilitating, but also, with support can be functional. So I want to talk now, going into chapter 9, talking about suicide. Probably for the next 10-15 minutes, we'll talk about suicide as we finish up the lecture today. We talked about how in depression there can be thoughts of death, thoughts of suicide. And so I want you to understand a little bit more about suicide and the significance of it, how much it happens. I think we hear about it. We don't actually know sometimes how much it affects people. It's definitely something that is one of the leading causes of death in the world. And I think each of us has either known or known someone who knows someone who has completed a suicide. So it is something that is a preventable cause of death. And I hope that after we talk about suicide today, we're going to understand what are some of the symptoms of it and then what you can do. Your assignment for this module includes looking at the Cognito website, where you're going to go in and get some training in an avatar environment where you're going to get some practice with how do you talk to someone about suicide, and what is kind of that mental health first aid you can apply to help someone who may be talking about or hinting at, and how can you recognize if they are hinting at suicidal ideation. So let's talk about what suicide is. Of course, suicide is a self-inflicted death, and that is one that one makes intentionally and is with conscious effort to end their life. If someone dies accidentally by their own cause, but it wasn't an intent, for example, they go to unplug something and accidentally electrocute themselves, that wouldn't be considered suicide. Suicide is where it's self-inflicted death. And when we talk about suicide, suicide is not actually a psychological disorder. So like I mentioned, depression can have a component of thoughts of death and suicide. So that's why we're specifically talking about that today. So suicidal behavior is not actually a specific psychological disorder, although the American Psychiatric Association, who makes the DSM-5, is talking about adding a suicidal behavior disorder to the DSM-5 in the future. So we know what suicide is. We know how it can impact us. So what causes it? We can look at a variety of different triggers that people that trigger suicide. And of course, suicidal research, how do we know what triggers suicide, right? And here we see a picture of Robin Williams. Many of you know Robin Williams, and you know that he completed suicide tragically. And so what is it that triggers suicide? It's important to know that, because if you have something happen in your life, or if you know someone who's happening, some of these things happening in their life, you want to be able to recognize, like, that can be really impactful. And if they don't have the right supports, or if they don't have the right coping skills, or, help, that this could be something that triggers this for them. So being aware is just one of the first steps in prevention of suicide. So common triggers for people about suicidal thought or ideation and behavior are significant stressful events in their lives. You're going to see any kinds of mood or thought changes, so depression, or like again bipolar disorder, or just a change in how they think about things. Alcohol and drug use contributes to suicidal thought and suicidal behaviors. Mental disorders or psychological disorders, specific psychological disorders, make people more likely to attempt suicide as well. And then modeling, people who see others model suicidal behavior. So let's look at each of these briefly. Stressful events can be things like immediate stressors or long-term stressors. So stressful events can be sudden loss of someone they care about. It can be rejection. So people who experience rejection can threaten to commit suicide or will complete a suicide. Divorce can bring up a lot of emotions in people, and loss of a job, significant financial distress, Sometimes a natural disaster and the losses that come along with that can trigger suicidal thought. Long-term stressors can be people who are extremely isolated. It's so important. Connection is so important for us as humans. And so long-term stressors of, being socially isolated, being alone for a long time can lead people to depression. Having a serious or terminal illness even, stress at work, and any type of environment that is abusive or somehow repressive can also be triggering. So those are those long-term stressors, things that can go on for a long period of time. People who feel controlled, that's what we're talking about, the abusive or repressive environment. Mood changes or thought changes, usually you're going to hear about someone who, if someone is experiencing suicidal thought and you talk to them and you're like, I didn't know they were experiencing that, one thing to look for would be, are they expressing any kind of hopelessness? Are they expressing the dichotomous thinking? In other words, that all or nothing thinking, like it's all bad, there's no hope, there's, the only thing I can do now is die to get out of this. So any change, big change in their mood can be triggering. Alcohol and drug use. 70% of people who attempt suicide use alcohol before they do it. And a quarter of those people become legally intoxicated. Any kind of substance is going to, affect and impact your judgment. It's going to either reduce your inhibitions or increase your impulsivity. So that can contribute and trigger suicide attempts. People who have depression, bipolar disorder, I already mentioned with bipolar how in the manic stage people can be more likely to act impulsively. Long-term alcohol use and also schizophrenia, people who are hearing, encouragement to harm themselves, they're having hallucinations in that form, can be likely to trigger suicidal behavior. Other disorders that are common with suicidal behavior are post-traumatic stress, panic disorder, substance use disorder, we talked a little bit about that, and then borderline personality disorder we didn't mention, but we'll talk about personality disorders down the road. But with borderline personality disorder, there is a strong fear of being abandoned, and sometimes people with borderline often people with borderline personality disorder will threaten suicide, like if you're going to leave me, I'm going to kill myself, because of that strong fear they have of abandonment. So there are a lot of predictors, I guess, of things that we can see that can maybe trigger us to say, oh, that might be something that could predict suicide. We'll see people who have experienced all of those triggers, the stress, or one of those triggers, stress, big changes in their life, huge disappointments, financial distress, occupational, something has happened in their work. All of those things that have happened can be triggering. And then how we can identify someone who maybe is considering suicide. They might be giving away their belongings. They might tell you, I don't know if living is really worth it. They might say something about, I wish I could go to sleep and not wake up. So hinting at suicide. And when we talk about that, sometimes people have in mind like, oh, there's just certain ages are more at risk of suicide. People might think, adolescents are really impulsive. But when we look at suicides per 100,000 population, we see a really high suicide rate for people who are over age 75. So people who are elderly, who have chronic illness, or who have lost a spouse are at high risk for depression and also at risk for suicide. When we talk about adolescents, like I mentioned, they can be notoriously impulsive. Their brain hasn't fully developed. And there's a lot of stressors. There's a lot of changes in adolescence with puberty and hormonal changes and just the developmental stress that goes along with adolescents, particularly among the LGBTQ community. A lot of difficulty for those folks who have enormous amounts of pressures both in the family and community, especially if they have not a lot of support for their sexuality, for their orientation. So there is a percentage-wise, there's a higher percentage of adolescents in that community, the LGBTQ community, who attempt suicide and complete suicide. Depression, if a adolescent is experiencing depression, then they're going to be more at risk as well. If they have any kind of anger or impulsive behavior issues, and of course alcohol and drug issues, and if they if they have someone who they know who's modeled suicide for them, shown them how to do it, or someone who they admire who has completed suicide, it also puts them at risk. But like I mentioned, when we're talking about age, the elderly are also at risk. And so this woman, I believe in the Netherlands, put a "do not resuscitate. I am 91 years old and plus." That is not that's not suicide. That is just saying she doesn't want to be resuscitated if she dies. But they have to abide by that. And here in the U.S., we also can, you can sign a DNR, do not resuscitate directive. So if you are older and you don't want to be resuscitated, when you die of natural causes, they won't resuscitate you. But that's not considered suicide. It's not an intentional death. But elderly are at risk for suicide because, like we said, they have sometimes terminal illnesses, and so there may be loss of their social status over time, or just feeling loss of their purpose in life. And so they're at high risk for depression and loneliness. So it's really important to be aware of that and sensitive to that for this population. So what do you do for people who are, what is treatment like for people who have attempted suicide? Of course, safety is the number one treatment for people who have attempted suicide. As a therapist, you want to make sure they're safe, connected, and that they understand other ways to soothe themselves, and also help them find a way out of thinking about suicide, because those thoughts, the thoughts of suicide, and if you've ever experienced it yourself, are temporary and typically will not last forever. And those people who've experienced it and moved through it usually say how grateful they are. I would say all of them say how grateful they are that they didn't complete the suicide at that time when they were at that low point, and instead sought help. And helping people understand who've experienced or who are in the midst of that low point and having those suicidal thoughts, helping them understand that it will pass, and that it's temporary, the feelings that they're having, but the act of suicide is permanent, and how many people are impacted, and how there are people that do care about them that can offer support. And so there are prevention programs, of course, for suicide prevention. There are hotlines, crisis hotlines. Here in Stanislaus County, I wanted to offer that number. There's actually a team of therapists who work for Stanislaus County here in Modesto, and they are on that phone 24/7. They operate at a place called the Psychiatric Health Facility, PHF. It's a place where people can go to get safe and stable without being admitted to like a mental hospital. It's a temporary 23 hours or less kind of place, but they can go there and stabilize. But those same therapists are on this thing called the Stanislaus County, not Count, warm line, and that's the phone number. It's 209-558-4600. That's the number for 24/7 help. Also, we have Pirate Care here at MJC and counselors that you can talk to. But most important thing I want you to know about suicide is if you know of anyone who has hinted or started giving away things, or has, maybe giving you somehow the impression that they are in the state of hopelessness or despair or feeling like this is the only option, the best thing to do is to ask them directly, are you thinking about killing yourself? That is the most difficult question to ask. Feels like the most awkward thing to ask, but I will assure you that no one has ever gotten the idea to commit suicide by someone asking them, are you going to commit suicide? Are you planning to kill yourself? You know, people will say, you know, no person's going to say, well, I hadn't thought about it, but now that you mentioned it, yes, I do want to kill myself, right? Nobody's going to say that. So it's important to, they've either thought of it or they haven't, and or they've thought about it and dismissed it and said, no, you know, I'm not going to do that. I wouldn't do that, or whatever. Or maybe, yeah, it's come up in my mind and I don't like that it's come up in my mind. Where has this come from? You know, but it's an act of opening that conversation. It's an act of caring, and from there, then talking with them, reaching out, getting support is so important. So I want to encourage you, as people who are studying psychology, just be aware of that. And as a way to care and intervene, just being, you know, open to the idea that this happens. It can be associated with depression. It can be a symptom of depression. It isn't always, but there is something that you can do about it, and that is to ask. So I'm going to leave you with that. We're going to end our lecture today. Please go ahead and finish the lecture quiz that you have here on Canvas, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Bye-bye.